just for the sake of argument, throw out how the injuries occurred. Throw that out the window. You still have a duty as a parent to provide medical care for a 12-year-old child.
A Texas teen is dead just before her 13th birthday, and authorities say the people who were supposed to protect her instead let her die. And the sheriff says the little help they did provide was outrageous. We are taking a closer look at this latest case of alleged child neglect with a forensic pathologist and former chief medical examiner. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. This week, deputies in Atascosa County, Texas, arrested a mother and stepfather and charged them with first-degree felony for injury to a child by omission. We're going to explain what that is in a minute, but according to the sheriff, 12-year-old Miranda Sipps had been unconscious in her home for 4 days when her mother, 36-year-old Denise Balbaneda, finally called 911. Balbaneda told deputies that Miranda, a cheerleader with the Jordanton Junior High cheer team, had gotten some sort of very serious injury on August 8th, which is a Thursday. First responders weren't called until the following Monday, so now you're getting a timeline there. And right now, Miranda's autopsy results are still pending, and the sheriff wouldn't say exactly what her injuries were when he was questioned by reporters. Take a look.
The injuries were life-threatening. They put her into a state of being unconscious. She was not talking. She basically could flutter her eyes and move her hands a little bit. Over a 4-day period, they had her laying on a pallet in the house. I will not, at this point in time, go into the injuries, detail on the injuries or how they happened, because I'm not 100% sure. And I don't want to sit up here and tell y'all these injuries happened this way, and I find out they happened a different way. So we're going to get to the bottom of it before we address how the injuries occurred. They did get oxygen for her at one time, I think.
You say that she received smoothies? They were drinking smoothies?
They were trying to give her smoothies. But somebody that's unconscious is not able to swallow.
Do you know if there was a welfare check done at this home previously in the last year or so?
No, ma'am, I don't know all of that. We had calls for service at that house in the past. I don't have the information on what those were or when they were, but all of that becomes part of the investigation. And those things may come out later, or they may not have anything to do with it.
So right now, if you don't know exactly what happened or how did it happen, what are the basis of the arrest in criminal charge?
What we do know is what they told us, what the mother told us.
Did they confess?
Basically, yes. Yes. Both of them basically confessed. But as to how the injuries occurred exactly, you know, we still have a little bit of doubt. We need to figure that out. Just for the sake of argument, throw out how the injuries occurred. Throw that out the window. You still have a duty as a parent to provide medical care for a 12-year-old child. And that's what we're talking about right here.
Sheriff,
we're not talking about them assaulting the child, trying to kill the child, or anything like that. We're talking about them failing to act and get that 12-year-old girl medical attention like she should have got.
Did they show any kind of remorse so far?
A little bit, maybe.
Not really.
Not like a regular
No.
parent or mother?
No, not like you or I or any of us probably would. The mother, as my investigator said, not really at all. The stepdad did exhibit some remorse. They thought they could nurse her back to health. And we do not think they wanted the attention that this would draw to them if the little girl was injured, which is strangely ironic, but that was their line of thinking.
Hey, so I want to thank Upside for sponsoring this episode of Sidebar and making episodes like this happen. Upside is a free app that gets you cash back on daily essentials like gas and groceries. So when I pump my gas, I can use it and get cash back when I fill up my tank. And yes, this is actual real cash back that can go right into your bank account. So once you have the Upside app, you claim an offer for whatever you're buying on Upside. You pay as usual using a debit or credit card. You follow the steps on the app and you get paid. So to find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside or scan the QR code on screen and use our promo code SIDEBAR and you'll get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Hope you can check it out. Now, according to the sheriff, Balbaneda made the 911 phone call from the home, but then put Miranda into a car to drive her to the hospital herself, and that's when EMS intercepted her while she was on the way, and they ended up putting Miranda into an ambulance. Now, the sheriff says they worked on her for about an hour, but sadly she died. So Balbaneda and Miranda's stepfather, 40-year-old Gerald Gonzales, they each face a felony charge of injury to a child by omission, and it's a first degree. So under the Texas Penal Code, it's defined as when a person commits an offense if he intentionally or knowingly by omission causes to a child serious bodily injury. And it's our understanding that a sentence, if a defendant is found guilty of injury to a child by omission, can vary quite widely here for a first degree, with a minimum of 5 years in prison and a maximum of 99 years or life. The couple each has a $200,000 bond set right now. And for now, the sheriff says they are not looking at murder charges for Balbaneda and Gonzales because they don't believe the couple caused Miranda's injuries. They allegedly just didn't take care of her once it happened. However, as we know, this investigation is ongoing. News station KSAT in Texas requested records from Atascosa County that show law enforcement, as you heard the sheriff say, responded to 3 calls at Miranda's home before she was found unconscious. And on March 28th, deputies were called for a welfare check. The report only states that a female was seen with scratches, but when deputies got there, a male and female told them the confrontation was all verbal. Back in November, Jordanton Elementary School called Child Protective Services to report marks on a child, and CPS allegedly reported that information to the Sheriff's Department, but it seems no other information was provided. The sheriff did say during his news conference that no other children besides Miranda were living in the home at this time. She does have at least one brother who lives with his biological father in another city. That's, again, according to the sheriff. The third call, by the way, was back in October of last year, and a person called 911 to report Gonzales was at the home and refused to leave. Sheriff's deputies responded, separated the parties involved. Now, school was not back in session yet in the area, and the sheriff says that Miranda's injuries and death are not connected to the junior high, but the district did put out a statement saying that counselors would be on hand for any students who need them when school is back in session, and that's not surprising considering what we're talking about here. I do want to let everybody know that Miranda's aunt started a GoFundMe to pay for the funeral expenses. We'll put it up right here in case you want to support. Now I want to bring in a special guest. I'm joined right now by Mary Jumbelic, a forensic pathologist, former chief medical examiner for Onondaga County, New York. Thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. What do you make, let's first start, what do you make from the sheriff's comments during that press conference?
Well, I think it's so important when there is the death of a child that it's investigated properly. It's going to hinge on seeing the site of where the death occurred, or in this case, injury occurred, evaluating that, and then taking the parents' statements into consideration, determining if there's any other witnesses to any events that transpired. And critical is the autopsy and follow up with that. So doing a very thorough pediatric autopsy, looking head to toe, front and back, for any skin injuries, scars, internally any injuries, or prior remote injuries. All of that will play into determining the veracity of what the parents have to say. At the very least, the delay in seeking medical care is a huge red flag for potential abuse.
And I have a lot of questions about this. First, when we talk about an autopsy, A, how long can the autopsy take? And B, how long till the report is published for the media and the public to know?
Well, I don't know the laws in Texas in terms of, how private or not. Like Florida has sunshine laws. You can get autopsy reports. New York, it's hard to get them if you're not the next of kin or an attorney. But I think that obviously the sheriff has a duty to kind of inform the public and the community about, what is happening. The autopsy itself can take anywhere from an hour and a half to 6-7 hours, depending on the complexity of it. And it's not just the autopsy. There will have to be a review of records. There will have to be toxicologic studies. I mean, I know smoothies were purportedly given, but was anything else given? Were there any drugs given? Maybe even to alleviate any symptoms, were there drugs given? So the toxicology will be important. X-rays will be important to see if there's any healing or new fractures. The sheriff had mentioned there were no broken bones, but I'm not sure how he determined that, or if there had been X-ray studies done at the hospital, perhaps. So all of those things might take a while. Also, they will do microscopic examinations. So if there's a bruise seen on the skin, a section may be taken and then looked at under the microscope. Is it an hour-old? Is it 4-day-old bruise? Is it a 2-week-old bruise? So that also can take, some time. I would expect that everyone's working really hard in this circumstance to come up with what happened to this little girl.
When we're talking, or when the sheriff is talking about life-threatening injuries and these serious injuries, what could that be?
That is so broad. It's so broad. I don't know if it's blunt trauma, if it's asphyxia, if it's sharp force injury. It's impossible to determine what he's referring to. We do know, at least based on what he says, that she's in a comatose state at some level of unconsciousness. But again, this is all according to the parents, and you have to determine the truthfulness of the story they're providing.
Right. I guess my question is, if she was alive for several days, seemingly suffering and wasn't getting the adequate medical treatment, is there some sort of condition she would be in that you could say that would make sense, where she could be alive for 4 days and then ultimately, because she didn't receive treatment, she died? I know it's a tough question, but...
It is a tough question. She might have sustained an injury and then was brought back from that injury. So someone, say, that has a near drowning, right? And so you pull them out of the water, you get them breathing again, you get their heart going again, but their brain is not functioning. So is she in some sort of state like that? I'm not suggesting drowning, I'm just using that as an example. Is she slowly bleeding to death from an internal injury that then leads to this lingering until she has lost now enough blood that her brain is not functioning? So it's nearly impossible to say without seeing her body and knowing what injuries she sustained.
When you conduct an autopsy of a child versus an adult, how is that different?
Well, a child, because they're not an adult, they are in a more vulnerable position in society. So there's usually someone responsible for them, whether that's a teacher, a parent, a caretaker. And so if anything happens to them and they die, you have more responsibility to really look at this so carefully and figure out what happened, whether it's an infant or a 12-year-old. And we do that, and there's a protocol for that type of autopsy that is not going to leave any stone unturned, that we're going to look so carefully at all the layers of the skin on the front and the back and make sure there is no prior injuries or remote abuse.
This may be a juvenile question, but is it, in a way, easier to detect injuries in a child than it is an adult? Is it easier to determine what happened than when you're dealing with an adult who already maybe has a whole history of different things that happen with their body and just the circumstances of the body? Was curious about that.
Well, I mean, in some ways it is easier to do a child autopsy because in most cases they have less disease present. So
Right.
As we become adults, our organs age, we develop coronary disease, we might have smoking changes in our lungs, we might have changes in our liver, all of that. Whereas in a child, those organs are more pristine.
And by the way, is there anything that you've seen where they could have allegedly contributed to the harm, to the death? What do I mean by that? we mentioned the smoothies, but if they were allegedly providing her oxygen, could that have contributed to the severity of the injuries, contributed to her death in any way?
Well, it's all speculation at this point
Sure.
because we don't know the injuries, but I would say it's a huge red flag that there's a delay in seeking medical care. So a child has an injury that sounds very significant in this case. The sheriff is calling it life-threatening, and yet no medical care is sought. So it makes their story suspect from the very start of it. So whatever they're saying about how this injury occurred, myself, as a medical examiner, I would be highly suspect as to that story. And I would want to look at the autopsy results and then from that objective information, see if that makes any sense.
Before I let you go, I just wanted to ask you one more thing about the timing of the injuries. How clear can we determine when an injury was inflicted or not? It becomes a key factor in child deaths, particularly younger children, when we say, oh, sometimes a defendant will say, oh, that injury was from they fell off the playground 2 days ago, and versus what might have happened the night before. So when we're dealing with these kinds of injuries, how much of a time frame can the injuries tell us?
Well, in this particular circumstance, we have a time frame based on their own admission, 4 days.
Right.
You know, now they change their story along the way. That frequently happens. But if there are bruises, if there's bleeding, then that can be taken and looked at under the microscope. You can definitely say that's a 24-hour-old injury or that's a 4-day-old injury. It's related to the medical care for the 2 hours in the hospital, or no, this happened days earlier. It gets harder when you're trying to split hairs of 4 days versus 5 days or 4 days versus 3 days, but I think that we have a general framework here to work from. As far as if there's bony injury, if there's healing on that, you can make some statements that that was older. And then you don't just look at the timing of the injury, but you look at the story. Does the story make sense with the injury that you're seeing, or does it not make sense?
You know, Mary, thank you so much for coming on, because I have to tell you, whenever I interview forensic pathologists, medical examiners, I think it's some of the most important work in law enforcement. And I have to tell you, I think the work that you do helps tell the story. And it's incredible to see how much the body and the injuries can really explain things that maybe contradict what the initial story is or not. The body doesn't lie. So Mary Jumbelic, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. Sad story, but you know, thank you so much for your insight on this.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.